Richard, Emily, welcome to Validated.
Thanks for having us, Austin.
Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you guys on. There's so much to talk about today with the crazy, wild world that is Tensor. So I'm kind of excited to dive into a little bit of the history, the launch originally, the sort of I think the sort of pretty famous Tolly tweets at this point being there's two devs and they've built an AMM for NFTs, and then now to look at what's going on with Vector, the new thing you guys launched, I guess, about a month ago, 2 months ago at this point, and really seeing where everything is kind of going from there. So I think it's pretty rare to find teams that have launched what I would call successive viral products as much as that exists in crypto, especially ones where sort of multiple versions of it have been successful over at least a decent duration of time. So I kind of want to start out today, before we get into Vector and a bunch of the stuff that's happening now, with how'd you guys first get interested in building in this space? How do you think of product development before you actually decide what you want to build and launch it? Maybe Richard, we can start off with you.
Yeah, I would say building Tensor and building Vector were quite different in terms of the approach that we went about with. I would say when we first started Tensor, like you mentioned, it was literally just us two in a room in a stateless co-working space. And we were just hacking away, 10, 12 hours a day. And that was all we did for, 6, 7 days a week. And we did that until we got our first 100 users, our first 1,000 users, and eventually 10,000, 500,000, a million monthly active users. I would say that when it came to building Tensor, we basically launched the first prototype with full public access. That was because, one, we were basically nobodies, and two, we actually wanted to see if people could give us feedback as they were using the app, and we could engage with them on Twitter. And we can engage with them by reaching out to them and say, hey, I noticed that you had this problem. You mentioned this on Twitter. Can we, hop on a call and chat about it? It also gave us a bit of publicity, especially as we were winning, the Solana hackathons. Tolly started tweeting about some of our announcements. That was the strategy that we had to use because we were essentially nobodies in the ecosystem. Of course, we quickly grew to the number one spot on the NFT marketplace side on Solana. And, a couple months ago, about 9 months ago, we decided that, hey, the NFT market isn't really growing. It's sort of stagnating. And a lot of people's attention in the space have focused elsewhere. A lot of people were looking into tokens. They're looking into meme coins. And that's when we decided that, hey, we have to make this tough decision. We have to try to figure what products that we can build now that the NFT market is dead. And potentially we need to pivot hard into a different market. That's when we decided to work on Vector. And I think with Vector, because we had distribution from our existing user base, we could approach the product development quite differently. And that's when we decided, hey, we're actually going to build in stealth for 3 to 4 months. We're going to iterate hard with basically 100 to 200 beta users. And we're going to keep doing that until we feel the magic.
So how did you know or gain enough confidence that you'd found the magic?
We didn't. We just kind of, a lot of these decisions are intuition based. You kind of know okay, well, things isn't working. There feels like there's something here in the new area, but really until you go and try, you're not going to know.
Right. Give us an overview for those who are not familiar. What is Vector?
Yeah, Vector is a social trading app. The easiest way to think about this is Robinhood marries X or Twitter. So you basically have a bunch of people trading back and forth, but then there's this feed. And the feed has these things called broadcasts. And they're kind of really like tweets, except each one is attached to a trade on chain. And so it's fully verifiable. And so it's really this feed of people doing trades and then posting a short message with each trade. And turns out that's actually a really fun feed to scroll because you're kind of oh, okay, this guy has a thesis. It was developing this way. Then it worked or it didn't work. That's basically what Vector is today.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's been a lot of people who have had the Telegram trader chat, right? It's hey, I'm going to make this trade. Here's why I'm making this trade, or I just made this trade. Here's why that happened. And then you've sort of had I mean, for a little while, Dialect was looking at building sort of like on-chain chats that got bolted on to like AMMs and DEXs and those sorts of things. But you guys did something a little bit different there in how you combined the two things, right? You're almost exploding the memo field in a typical blockchain transaction, which was designed to put in, whatever arbitrary data you might want to add in about a trade, but turning that into like a social feed. Like, where did that sort of idea come from for you guys about, hey, you know what people actually want is not just a place to trade, but a place to chat about trades?
So it actually didn't come to us initially when we started working on Vector. It was something that we discovered because we were iterating in private for 3 to 4 months before we actually launched it more broadly. So initially, like, the idea for Vector was, hey, we see this gap in the market, which is a lot of people are trading meme coins. They might be using something like Phantom, so a generalized wallet on their phone, but then they're also switching over to an analytics app like DexScreener to look up token information and to get the latest stats, the latest price for meme coins that were launched 10 seconds ago. So our initial hypothesis was, hey, what if we combine these two apps and made it one single mobile app and had a seamless trading experience that had a wallet integrated into it so that you could do all the discovery that you need to trade some of these newer tokens, these meme coins. So that's what we initially built. The V1 took about a month or two. But then we realized, hey, this is nice, but it's very incremental. Like, maybe it's 10, 20% better, maybe even 30% better than using DexScreener and Phantom on your phone. But this isn't enough to convince people to switch over entirely from their existing workflow on Phantom DexScreener. And so we went back to the drawing board. We actually brought together the entire team during an offsite, and we had this giant brainstorming session. And actually one person on the team, it wasn't us, it wasn't me or Ilmoy, came up with the idea of, hey, what if we could actually share trades on this app and create this like social interaction? And that was sort of like kicked off this whole rabbit hole down social.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting because when I think of social products, I think of them as, like, in some ways, the least successful part of YouTube is the social feed, right? The comments and the things in a video are like, they're there, but like, there's kind of the like, oh, don't actually look at the comments. Like, they're probably not the point. And you guys kind of flip that model on its head where you were able to bring like the comments and the content that usually is considered like a bonus or an add-on and make that kind of the core product, but in something that's largely considered like a competitive space. Like, trading is not usually thought of as like a, oh, we're all going to win together. I mean, in some circles, sure, but on some very level, like, people think of like your loss is my profit is your loss type of structures. And so I'm kind of curious, like, what gave you guys the idea that like actually people want community around trading the same reason they want community around NFTs? And was there sort of any like direct connection there in how you guys were thinking about building this product out after building out such a successful NFT marketplace?
Yeah, I think Andreessen says it. He says there's no bad ideas, there's just wrong timing. And I think like that's very true of startups. The idea of social trading is a very old idea. And if you actually look at all the attempts, they all failed. And they all failed because, in our view at least, the timing was just not right. First of all, you really need a very social asset class to trade socially. And stocks is just not it. Nobody trades Apple because their friends aped Apple. They trade Apple because Apple throws a bunch of cash. That goes to stockholders. And you can do a DCF model on it. You can't do a DCF model on Fartcoin, at least not as far as I'm concerned. And so how do you trade Fartcoin, an important asset? Well, it turns out you figure out if your friends want to ape it. And so now you have a fertile ground for building a social product. Okay, that's cool. But even then, that's not enough. You got to figure out what's the right form factor. And I would argue desktop is not the right form factor. Because for social products, you want to be in the moment. You want to be with your friends. You want to be like on the couch. You want to be in the bar. You whip out Vector, you start trading. So that's an important product decision. And infrastructure for building good mobile products in crypto just didn't exist 2-3 years ago. So that changed, right? So that starts to you can start to see where timing starts to matter. And then there's obviously iteration on the actual feed and the broadcast card. Like, what are you actually sharing? Do you really need a message or not? Do you show a chart? Do you not? Like how many trades do you show on the chart? How many people do you show on the chart? All of that just takes time and it kind of takes iteration. And if you just follow your gut and you're like, well, is this fun to look at? Like, we're very degenerate. And I think that's our superpower as a team. We just like look at something and we're like, okay, this is too boring. How do we make it fun? And if you do that enough times, you end up with kind of where Vector is today, where it's like actually fun to scroll. It's a very social asset class. It's on mobile. It's in your pocket. You do it with your friends. So I think like we feel it's just the right time for this idea. And we feel that now is actually the time to build the first ever like real social product around trading.
So it's super interesting to hear you talk about it as like something you want to be able to like pull out at a bar or pull out with when your friends like hanging out. Because what that reminds me of instantly is sports betting. And it's a very different product, of course. It's not betting, it's, but you sort of had to create your own sports, right? Like the power of sports betting is like you're watching the game anyway. Let's add some financialization fun to it. But here you're like watching the chart is like a thing that some traders do, but I don't think most people would consider that to be fun. But suddenly you add this like chat messaging social layer on top of it, and there's something there that feels very communal in something that's usually a very solitary activity. It's interesting that you go straight to the mobile app though, because I think intuitively there's this, maybe this is a generational thing that like big high value stuff is done on a computer. And maybe that's no longer the case. I just think it's really interesting that you guys were like able to carve out this like this idea of like it needs to be social, therefore it needs to be on a phone. Like that's a very interesting innovation because so little of crypto today is still done on phones. Or if it is, it's all low value.
Yeah. I don't think necessarily that high value or low value is what determines whether or not you're on desktop and mobile. You can build an equally as secure experience on mobile than on desktop. In fact, I would argue that mobile is probably 2x more secure than desktop. One, the whole Chrome extension thing makes no sense. All of these Chrome extensions, the permission that they ask you for is I can read and modify anything on any website that you visit. That's essentially, and every Chrome extension has this permission. Well, a lot of Chrome extensions have this permission, and that's actually how a lot of hacks happen with crypto users. Mobile, they actually thought, iOS and Android thought about this very carefully, where they actually containerize your app. And your app only has limited access to things that the app has, its own app data, and also has limited access to certain peripherals. So I would argue mobile is actually more secure. And the other thing I think with timing, going back to Ilmo's point, is that I think with some of the innovation with embedded wallets, these embedded wallets essentially let you self-custody with the Web2 login. It's actually made it possible to build a really great mobile experience now without all the complexities that we know of, as OG crypto users with having to write down a seed phrase. So I would argue that it's less so about social and us having to build a mobile experience around social. It's more so that we feel like this is the end state. Most people in the world are actually on their mobile phone. They're not using desktop, especially overseas. And I think like maybe it's like you mentioned, it's a generational thing where I think people in the older generations have always been used to desktop.
How do people find community on Vector? Like what's that, if I'm coming in for the first time to the platform, like what's that journey like?
The way you grow a social network is actually very different to the way you grow a utility product. And the most common question we get from really smart people in the space these days is, hey, when are you guys going to open the app? And what's maybe a little bit not obvious is that actually keeping the app gated by codes is a very intentional design choice for go-to-market. So answering your question, there's two ways you could get on the app. You can get on the app completely on your own, and you're probably going to be a little lost because you don't know any of these people. There's this feed, like, who are these guys? How can I trust them? What if it's all a rug? Very valid questions. Sure. So you probably don't ever upload balance, you never trade, and you churn. The other option is your annoying friend pesters you with a code. You finally download the fucking app. You get in. You're like, all right, what do I do here? At least you have somebody to ask questions. And at least you have one guy to follow. And then from there, like he tells you, hey, follow these couple guys. And you follow a couple guys. You upload $100 and you start playing. And all of a sudden, you're actually an activated user. And so keeping the invite system and getting people to invite their friends is how like a lot of the best social networks grew. And that's exactly the playbook we're following for Vector.
Interesting. What do you think is the primary motivator for the average vector user?
It's funny. We had a chat with Nikita Beer. He's actually advising us on how to make vector more viral in social. And one thing that he said that really stuck out to us was he believes that in crypto and trading crypto trading in general, 51% of it is flexing and 49% of it is profit. And I think that hits the nail on the head. I think that's exactly the behavior that we landed on with Vector, where yes, you could argue that Vector may not be a trading app that has all the fancy professional tools that you might have on a desktop trading app. And you might not be able to maximize, all the different advanced order types that you set to, maybe get, 5-10% extra boost in your profit. Obviously that's debatable because it depends on your skill level.
Sure.
But I would say that a lot of people use Vector and continue to come back, and more people are joining the app because of that 51%, value prop of flexing your trades. We have this personality on our app, Function. Basically, one of the first trades he made on the app, he bought a token, not a lot of it, went to bed, and the next day he was basically up, 10,000%. And a lot of people were screenshotting it and sharing it on Twitter and basically pinging him saying, hey, wake up, man, you're up 10,000%. You made just an incredible trade. And I think that is exactly what people are looking for on Vector, is being able to do these amazing trades or watch other people do these amazing trades and being able to share that with their friends.
It's so interesting because there's so many similarities there to Twitch. And the early days of Twitch, when it was like, oh, it must be more fun to play video games and watch people play video games. Like if you haven't gone, I'm not a Twitch person, but it sounds like a foreign experience to think that would be more fun than playing the game myself. But it's interesting because you're talking about something that feels like a very similar dynamic where people are enjoying watching people they know get rich or do a really good trade. And it sort of flips it on its head because so much of the OG trading culture is I got this advantage you didn't get. You should feel bad, or look at how good I am. And it sounds like it's a much more almost communal and win-win from that perspective in what you're describing.
Well, the biggest thing we're trying to do is to get people on Vector to win more against people who are not on Vector. Look, trading at the end of the day is PvP, yes, but somehow there's traders who are better and somehow there's traders who are worse. Well, why can't we take people who are on the app and put them into better category? Little things we can do is surface better signal, surface better traders to follow, send them notifications when to sell, send them notifications where somebody they follow just sold. There's a lot of things that mobile form factor opens up that are just not very convenient on desktop. And it's funny because the deeper we go into this design space, the more we're like, wow, we can't believe nobody's trying this because all of this is completely up for grabs. And at the same time, there's 17 desktop apps trying to do all the same thing.
Yeah. So I guess the obvious place I go to there is I think the reason no one else has tried it is they're afraid. It's a lot of, in the classic platform risk sense, there's a lot of risk in sending people push notifications that imply you should buy or sell. How did you guys, I'm sure you've spoken to a lot of lawyers and sort of navigated a lot of that design very carefully. How did you get to a place where you could launch a product that had some of those types of features that doesn't make the product just a giant lawsuit waiting to happen?
We're not trying to, tell people that, they can make a certain amount of money on this app. I think what's really important is, hey, you can do everything that you're currently doing on these desktop apps or, through the existing wallets where you're just buying and selling tokens. You can share that with friends, but we're not going to necessarily tell you hey, this is a really good token that you should buy, or this is a token that you should sell right now. We're just giving you the tools to set, for example, alerts. So a lot of this stuff is actually user initiated. So if I want to track a token, I can set an alert that notifies me when the token drops by 20% or if it goes up by 20%. We also send out push notifications about stats, about your current portfolio holding, so you can act on that. I think what's really important here is we're not trying to sell you this strategy or some platform that will give you automated strategies. Instead, we're giving you the control of the steering wheel. You decide how you want to use the product, but we'll make your life as easy as possible by giving you all of these helpful alerts that you can set.
Interesting. So I want to pivot a bit and talk about like what's actually happening like under the hood, right? Delivering sort of a experience that feels very much like you're trading on a centralized exchange is not easy, but it is sticky, right? It's part of making these products successful is like, I mean, half of like Robinhood is basically E-Trade with a new UI on top of it. And that's not, you know, to detriment Robinhood, but like we fundamentally had a lot of the Robinhood technology for 20 years, but it really took someone packaging it into a new format to make that successful. That's not the case in crypto, right? Solana's only been around since, you know, 2020. So when you guys are thinking about how do you design for a mobile experience, both like on the user interface side, which we talked about, but on like the backend technical layer, especially when this is all still self-custody, right? These are non-custodial systems you guys are running. How does that come together? What was the sort of the engineering under the hood look like?
Boy. Okay, I'm going to start with my rant of centralized exchanges are over, because I really think they are. Basically, what a centralized exchange is, you're trying to solve a lot of really complicated technical problems completely on your own, and there are zero other smart people looking at your code because everything's closed. And that works really nicely when the fastest blockchain confirms once in 30 seconds. But when you now have a blockchain that confirms within 200 milliseconds, and you have more developers than all centralized exchanges put together working to build layers and layers and layers of completely open permissionless infrastructure on top of those blockchains, what you very quickly find is that you can actually build better products using decentralized technology, not worse. It's like, I remember 4 years ago getting into crypto, everybody was like, well, you know, when are people actually going to start using wallets? And the answer was always obvious. It's when the wallet is actually more frictionless than the centralized exchange. And we're there. We're literally there. Like,
yeah.
Vector today takes an email to sign up. You deposit money using MoonPay takes literally 30 seconds. And you can basically trade 3 million tokens on Solana with like second confirmation speeds. You never had to KYC. You never had to go through the complicated, you know, centralized exchange bullshit. I think it's over for sexes. And like, the stack on the back end to power all of that is you basically have Solana, then you have a bunch of DEXs like Radium, like Orca. Then you have basically our own aggregation layer where we route orders to different DEXs depending on the trade, the size, the liquidity. There's like a lot of variables. And then obviously there's all kinds of like fancy transaction sending technology like Jito and Bloxroute and Temporal and a bunch of others to like prevent users from being MEV'd and all of that stuff. But all of that is only going to keep improving. And what you really end up with is just this beautiful stack that is completely open to anybody who wants to take it. And you can build like products that are 10x better with like literally 1/10 the engineering effort.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is like very much the superpower of decentralized exchanges. But you said something really interesting there, which is that you're routing to multiple places like on the back end. That has like, I think Jupiter is pretty much the only one that's made that into like a profitable business besides you guys in the decentralized space. Like, talk to me a little bit about how all that plumbing works, like how you guys figure out where to route stuff, like what the monetization looks like, because I think it's very easy to sort of say, oh, like, you know, we'll just route orders to a bunch of different places, but there's a huge amount of ingest data flow you need to even know what the prices are in 6 different DEXs that you're tracking. Plus there's like a cross-chain component to what you guys are doing too, right?
Yep. I think the right way to think about it is there are essentially aggregators on all of these different chains, like Jupiter, like 0x on EVM, that do a great job at, you know, doing that one thing, which is aggregating across all of the DEXs on my chain. What's more difficult is how do you build a nice cross-chain experience that leverages essentially the best-in-class aggregators on each of these chains, but also bridges that let you seamlessly swap tokens between chains and patch that all into a nice app, right? That is actually like, it might sound easy and maybe like on sort of like the nerd sniping spectrum, it is like maybe not as nerd snipey to build, you know, an app with a bunch of routing logic versus building a bridging protocol or building, you know, your own on-chain aggregator. But I would say that it's actually much harder because there's this constant feedback loop and essentially test and prod that you have to do with your users to figure out like, okay, there's a bit of like congestion on certain programs on Solana. Do we have to use Cheeto tips now? Do we have to use temporal? Do we have to use BlockSwap? Do we have to use all of these different services that give us a better user experience ultimately on the app layer? And all of this is non-trivial. It's non-stationary, meaning that things shift over time because everything is in production. And I would argue it is harder to get right. But of course, it's what the user ultimately wants, is being able to have a single seamless experience. They don't have to go to 3 different sites in order to buy tokens on 3 different chains. They just want a single app that does everything they can for them. And that's exactly what we've built in Vector.
It's interesting because you're kind of talking about not necessarily like an aggregation layer, but like an aggregation product, which is interesting because I think the aggregation layer is like one of those concepts in crypto I've been pretty bearish on, because the underlying things under the hood still require a ton of security assumptions. But the way you guys have kind of pulled it together is a very interesting approach to that, because you're not like you're building it backwards around the narrative structure of most of the aggregation layer stuff. But it's interesting because, as you're saying, you have a lot of the same characteristics that a centralized exchange would have, but you can leverage thousands of different developers working on independent projects and tie into all of that infrastructure that already exists.
Yeah, Brian tweeted this the other day, right? Where he said like Coinbase needs to move away from the whitelisting approach for tokens. The challenge for Brian is, and like obviously he is one of the most respected founders in the space, the challenge for him and any centralized exchange is there's just no process you can follow to like whitelist or blacklist all of these things if you basically sit behind a centralized book. Like you need to be on dexes. You need this thing to be fully permissionless, wild, uncontrollable like innovation. That's what crypto is. The long tail is what makes crypto exciting. I really think that 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, Sexes will be like this really weird, peculiar corner of crypto that people will look at as the Craigslist. It'll be like, oh yeah, do you remember when people actually traded on these things? Like, this is going to be so weird. And 90% of the volume will basically happen on DEXs. It will happen through aggregation platforms like Vector.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. So when you guys were thinking about growth for this, right? Vector, I think, has been, Tensor was a big success. Vector has been another level on top of that, is my understanding. Like, what did you have to do differently as you saw this thing grow and scale up to be able to actually support? I mean, you guys are doing what, over 20 million a day nowadays in volume?
Yep.
Yeah, so there's a lot of like, I think one of the pieces that like I'm particularly interested in going into 2025 is the process of going from a really good idea that has this sort of like viral moment to a like productionized, scalable, dependable product. And I'm sure that the build out of that was both smooth and at places rocky. Like, what was harder to scale than you anticipated, and what wasn't an issue that you thought might be as you guys have grown Vector out?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We're basically going through this process where we believe we've captured lightning in a bottle. We know that this product retains people really well. We know people are coming back every single day. And now we need to make sure that we're no longer a private beta or a beta app. We are now a serious app that you could depend on 99.99% of the time. And we are effectively ensuring that, when it comes to pushing out code, when it comes to changes to the platform, we are now placing a lot more emphasis on reliability, attention to detail, and having a more rigorous process when it comes to pushing out code. I think maybe that's the difference between what separates one cycle crypto projects that maybe have struck gold, but they sort of like winged it initially. And admittedly, like we did that for Tensor initially, right? We were just 2 guys in a room and we just built things as we felt like it. But over time, you do have to, put in the work, learn what it means to build a mass consumer product. And on the engineering side, know what exactly you have to do to ensure that the quality of the work that you're pushing out is at the level of any large, Web2 consumer app. And so that's just execution, right? Learning from other, learning from other companies or apps that have done it before. Reading engineering blog posts, learning best practices when it comes to improving reliability. All that stuff isn't hard. It's just like it requires more time, it requires more discipline, and it's less about, the Wild West. That being said, of course, we want to maintain our degen-ness because I think that's how you get more interesting ideas. But there is, the other side of it, which is you need discipline. You need to make sure that you're building a product that has longevity and meets the reliability guarantees that people expect.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing you guys get compared to, I think probably wrongly a lot, is you're lumped in the same category as something like pump.fun, right? Which is I think more of a it has some social components to it. It had a big social component that attracted a lot of attention and then was shut down. But I think there's like a pretty big difference in terms of what the community is built around and what those sort of like intentions are coming out of products, right? Like there's structural similarities on paper, but then there's very different product experiences. Like what was that product discovery piece like internally when you were building this to say, okay, we see the success of something like pump.fun. We're not building that, but we think there's this other component that exists. Because you guys did this with NFTs as well. This is kind of the piece that I think is so interesting because there were a ton of NFT marketplaces when Tensor, the NFT marketplace, launched, right? Like there's a lot of them out there. And you guys were able to build a product that serviced a different component of the market, but in the same vertical, for lack of a better term, and really crack something open there. And really the only other company that consistently does this is like Apple, right? They're not the first to release the thing, and you guys were certainly not the first to release a platform where you can trade tokens or a platform where you can trade NFTs, but you bring something to it that the rest of the market has sort of not seen before. I'm kind of curious, like going back to some of the original questions we started with, like I want to dig in a little more on that product development thing. Like, is that just you two as founders, like spending a lot of time together and like thinking about these things? Or how are you thinking about this space differently than you think other founders are to sort of consistently come up with these zags while everyone else is doing a zig?
Yeah, honestly, I wish I could say it was something magical that we knew about the world and most people don't, but I don't think we do. I think it's actually a combination of impatience and unwillingness to work on what exists. We'll just like look at like 5 versions of like pick your favorite product and be like, okay, we don't want to build a 6th version. And then naturally we like go, okay, what's the opposite of that version? Like if everybody's building desktop, what if we did mobile? If everybody's building pro apps, what if we did a social app? And like, look, I'll be the first to say it. There are 5 social apps right now. We wouldn't build one. It doesn't make any sense because who needs the 6th one? The really cool thing about thinking that way about the world is you don't know for a fact you're going to strike gold if you zig when everybody zags, but at least there's a chance.
Yeah.
Right. And you try enough times, one time you're going to strike gold. There were a lot of ideas because Richard said this, we were iterating this out for like months before we released it. There were a lot of ideas we tried that just didn't stick. And people were like, this is retarded. Like, why are you doing this? And then like eventually there was like this idea of a broadcast, and then we made a chart and then people liked it. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah. And eventually you basically stumble onto something that people like, but you have to be willing to look stupid for long enough until you stumble into something people like. And even right now, I don't think Vector today is the final format. I don't think the app today is what it's going to be like in 3 years. And I think we still have a lot of stupid decisions to make that's going to make it even more different. And most of them are going to be bad decisions. But there will be one good decision. And you just have to be like willing to look stupid for long enough to find it.
I kind of love that. I do want to kind of talk about the moderation thing, because I think for a long time people were like, look, there's been racist meme coins, there's been racist NFTs, there have been all these sorts of things that existed. And the perception in Web3 was sort of, this is Web3, this is different, right? We can deal with this, like the communities can moderate it out. We don't like, we're just going to ignore these things and keep building. And then the pump.fun live streams happened. And I think that was a moment where a lot of people were like, oh, maybe not that much freedom. Like maybe there was something wrong here. Like, to their credit, like they cleaned up that and they took those things down, and who knows, maybe we'll get some version of it back. But like, I'm kind of curious how you guys have thought about how you define the limits of like what is allowable and not allowable on the social side, because there's the technical reality of like the markets moderate themselves from a token perspective, right? Like there's certain quality indicators people look for, all these components, but people can just put whatever they want into a chat box. And that opens up a whole, I would say, series of problems that Web3 has not historically had to address and is maybe still learning how to address them. So I'm curious how you guys have thought through that problem set.
I think there is the argument that, there's basically two opposing arguments. One is like, hey, freedom of speech. Everyone should have a right to say whatever they want. And that's one of the, I'm not American, so correct me if I'm wrong here. That's one of the commandments of the US Constitution. And then there's the opposite side, which is, hey, we don't want to encourage toxic behavior. Not because, ethically, definitely, we don't want to encourage people to be completely, to witch hunt people and threaten people physically or online, or say something that threatens their identity. But I think the other part is it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel good for our users to constantly look at the feed and see a bunch of things that they could potentially find offensive. I think we're on the point where this is kind of a hard question. I don't think anyone has really cracked it. Even Facebook, some of these big Web2 companies, they haven't cracked moderation. There's stuff that gets through the cracks. That shows up on Facebook Live that people realize, hey, this is definitely not okay. It's sort of the double-edged sword of permissionless networks in general and permissionless platforms where anyone can create anything, and that's great. It's unlocked a lot of creativity. It's unlocked this whole new long tail of attention assets that people can create from the convenience of their phone. But it also has downsides that anyone can put anything up there and other people can see it.
Yeah.
We take sort of a more practical approach where we have moderation features in the app. You can report stuff as, you report a broadcast if there's a message in there that you think shouldn't be on the platform. And we'll look at all of these reports, and we have essentially a moderation policy where certain things we obviously have to take down. So things like, if it's completely racist, or if someone is threatening someone online, that's really bad. We don't want that on our platform. We don't want other people to see that. It just ruins the user experience. And then there are, of course, gray areas where we have to make a call and say, hey, this could be really bad for our users and we should take it down. Or maybe it's part of that freedom of speech argument where, people have the right to say whatever they want.
Yeah. I think it's going to be a thing that crypto will have to figure out how to deal with. And, Web2 had to figure out how to deal with it. They went too far in one direction. Now they're going back in the other direction. And we'll sort of see, I think, where that shakes out over time. So with Tensor, the NFT marketplace side of things, you guys have a token associated with that. I think there's been a lot of questions around, will something similar happen with Vector?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of people ask us, is Vector going to have its own token? And the answer to that is no. The token for Vector is TNSR. It's the same token that powers Tensor, the marketplace. Basically, the way to think about TNSR is, there's these ecosystems of products that form around tokens. Like Jupiter is a great example. Binance is a great example with BNB. TNSR is going to be an ecosystem like that. The first product in that ecosystem was the NFT marketplace, and TNSR played an important role there. But the second product in that ecosystem is Vector. And obviously right now, Vector is making pretty much exactly 10 times the revenue of the NFT marketplace. So kind of 90 million versus 9. And basically a part of that flows back to the treasury controlled by TNSR holders. And that's really kind of where TNSR starts to come in. So specifically, this week Foundation has announced that 50% of all the revenue generated in the product goes back to the treasury controlled by TNSR. It's exactly the same for the NFT marketplace. 50% goes back to TNSR. And so you can start to see how these multiple products are basically fueling this treasury that is going to become central to this ecosystem. And in return, obviously, Vector gets to benefit from, the foundation stewarding the protocols that power Vector. And also, Vector, the app, is going to be integrating TNSR in all kinds of really interesting ways that we're not announcing yet, but pretty sure the users are going to like it.
Awesome. Well, I think we all look forward to additional product developments. I'm personally excited to see what you guys build as your third product when that time comes, because 3 out of 3 would be quite the batting average.
And it has to be called scalar. Like it has to be called scalar because you have tensor, vector, scalar, full linear algebra nerds.
You better reserve that token.
Has to be scalar. Has to be scalar.
Nice. Love it. Well, Richard Demoy, thank you for joining us today on Validated. This has been great.
Yep. Appreciate it, Austin.
Thanks for having us. It was fun.